Okay, let's look at B example here. F of x is the square root of 2x minus 5, and I want to find the inverse again. Before we dive into the whole switching the x and the y around and solving for y, let's think to my function here for a second. My function, right now, let's look at what the domain would be and what the range would be. Okay. Now I have a problem if everything underneath the square root is negative. But it could be 0. So let's find out for a second. When would 2x minus 5 equal 0? Add 5 to each side and divide by 2 when x is 5 halves. Okay, if x was anything bigger than 5 halves, anything bigger than 2.5, everything's okay. If x was 2, then I'd have a problem because then we have a negative under the square root. So my domain, x has to be greater than or equal to 5 over 2. And then my range, similar to example 4a, my smallest number that would be underneath the square root is 0. Okay, can't have a negative under here. Smallest number under the square root is 0, which means when we take the square root of 0, we get 0. So my range, all my y values have to be greater than or equal to 0, which tells me for the inverse what the domain and the range would be. Okay, the domain of the inverse was the range of the original. So x is greater than or equal to 0. And then the range of the inverse is the domain of the original. Y is greater than or equal to 5 halves. So we need to keep this in mind when we are finding our inverse function. Okay, inverse function. First thing we need to do, switch the x and the y's around. And even though this is written as f of x right now, remember that's really another way of saying y. Switch my variables. We get x equals the square root of 2y minus 5. And I need to get y by itself. I'll square both sides first. And then add 5. And divide by 2. So this looks like what my inverse function is. But keep in mind, this square root of 2x minus 5 really just looks like half of a parabola. My inverse needs to just look like half of a parabola. So I only use this when x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, that's the only piece of that function I would look at. Because again, we have to restrict that domain.